I'm Seth.
And I am Evie.
Welcome to this Missional Monday, where we're going to talk about how we can be everyday missionaries where we live, work, play, and learn. Well, I'm going to talk about that. You're probably going to draw on the board, huh? Well, today we are talking about church. Now, if you've caught some of the old episodes that I've done of this, I've talked about church before, what it means to be the church. Because often when we talk about the word church, we're talking about a building or an institution, a hierarchy. But in the Bible, the word that's used for church is ecclesia, and literally means the called out ones. And it refers always, every single time, to a people, never to a building. But today we're going to talk about what does a church building mean? How did we get to this place where we're calling a building the church? And how does that affect how we live out our mission in the world? Because again, that's what we're about, is being missional, on mission. The same mission Jesus had, God is sending us. So, if you look back at church history, the very beginning, in the New Testament, the church is always a people. For the first 200 years of the church, they existed only as communities of followers of Jesus Christ, following after him. They would meet together in their homes. We see this time after time in Acts. Sometimes they would take a large gathering place, like an assembly hall, and they might gather a bunch of house churches together, and they would celebrate together. They might have a worship service together. They might celebrate communion together to symbolize that they are one. No, they didn't eat hot dogs. They didn't have those then.
Like hamburgers?
No, they didn't. I don't know about that. But anyhow, it was around 250 AD that the first buildings that were created just for Christians to gather and worship in, what we now call churches. And it was about 50 years later that we start to see cathedrals appear, which were these meeting halls where they also would have a place for a bishop to sit. It would kind of be the bishop's meeting hall, their congregation. It wasn't until after Rome adopted Christianity that the cathedrals that we would think of, that you might be able to visit in Europe, started to come on the scene. And what they were actually doing was they took some of the aspects of the temple in Jerusalem from the Old Testament, right? They started taking some of those things and bringing them into their worship spaces. As the Mass was developed, as they started celebrating the Mass together. They also, unfortunately, took aspects of pagan religions and how they worshipped, and they brought those into their meeting spaces as well. So when the Protestant Reformation came on the scene, they said, whoa. Some of these things, these are not what the church was originally about. They're not biblical. They're not in the Bible. And so they started to scale those things back. They really got pretty harsh on icons being in churches, different statues, different drawings. They made it much more simple in nature inside. My tradition, the Methodist tradition, John Wesley, the John Wesley scholar Ken Collins argues that Wesley, although he came well after the Reformation, should be seen as an extension of it, because he wanted to take the Christians back to the early church in many ways, to live into a more scriptural form of Christianity. And he was coming alongside the existing Anglican church, which already had its own buildings, its own cathedrals. And so when the Methodists were starting, they were not about building a bunch of new buildings. They weren't about creating new cathedrals. They were mostly about gathering together, again, in those small groups in homes, in what they called classes, and then even smaller groups, what they called bands. Not bands, but like a band of people banding together. Now, even when they started building their first assembly halls in early Methodism, they called them Methodist meeting houses. They didn't call them churches. And they had very strict rules on these, that they couldn't be made with bricks or stone. They couldn't have stained glass windows. And that was so all the money that you normally put into those buildings would get put instead toward mission. Now, some people will say, hey, Seth, there's just so much beauty in the artwork that glorifies God in these wonderful cathedrals in Rome and Europe, and art definitely can glorify God. I believe it can. But the thing that glorifies God the most is when we actually live out the mission that he called us to do. Like when we actually live the way God called us to live, right? There is nothing more beautiful than a life transformed by Jesus Christ, right? Every dollar that we spend on brass and gold and bricks and all that stuff is a dollar that we could have spent on the mission, that we could have spent helping the poor, that we could have spent helping the needy. The Methodists knew this, right? Unfortunately, as time went on, they started to drift away from some of these early regulations that they had. They wanted to be like everybody else, all the other denominations. And it really changed as well in all of American Christianity when the Sunday school movement came on the scene in the mid-1800s. Churches started to add onto the back parts of their buildings spots for education, for classrooms, right? If you go, whether it's an urban setting or a rural setting, most churches, the buildings that we use, they basically were a large space for people to gather for worship on Sunday because that's something you couldn't do in your home, right? You couldn't fit 100 people in your home, so you needed a space for that. So that's why they made these meeting houses so that they could gather together. They didn't have to worry about the other stuff because, the teaching was mainly done at the family level. But when the Sunday school movement came on, they added education wings. A similar movement happened here in the 90s and early 2000s especially, where churches started adding gymnasiums off the back for recreation, right? For youth groups to come. And when we look at these moves, there can be a good aspect to them and a bad one. The good aspect is some were thinking about how can we welcome others into the church? How can we reach them and do mission to them? But the flip side is that it can cause many churches to think about how can we withdraw from the world? How can we take more and more of our lives and fit it into what happens just here in this one place? And that's not the way that God ever called us to live. Every time we gather on a Sunday, we're gathering together to remember what Jesus Christ has done for us, right? We're gathering together to worship him and glorify God. But at the same time we are called in, we are also sent out. We are sent out into a world, into a mission field all around us to share the love of Christ with others in both word and in action. So, it might be more impactful for the kingdom of God, not for us to start a new gymnasium and start an Upward basketball league. I'm not hating on Upward, but just honestly, might be more impactful instead if all of us who are Christians joined the regular rec leagues at local schools and places like that, where you can go and you can make relationships with other people, with other parents and families and neighbors, and love them, get to know them. We want to be, again, everyday missionaries where we live,
You don't want to be alone and just stay at your home.
That's right. Learn and play. So, as we're ending here, I just want to know, what are your thoughts? What are your questions? You can leave those in the comment section below. But two, I'm bringing all this up because COVID is really, for a long time we couldn't gather together in buildings. We're now being able to come back into buildings. Most churches are gathering in some form.
Eat a yummy carrot.
And I want to remind you that the church is a community. I want us to lean more heavily into this, not to forget. What has your experience with this been, of being church as people, not church as a building? Again, leave your comments in the section below. And Evelyn, is there anything you would like to share before we sign off?
You could eat a yummy carrot on a hamburger.
Well, there you go. Wisdom from Evelyn. Have a great day.
Bye.